Thanks for that kind introduction. Thanks for everyone for being here. I'm not sure if there's a rock concert after this or something, but I'm really glad you all are here on a Tuesday afternoon at 5 p.m. So thank you, Owen, for inviting me, first off. I'm going to do what you usually are not supposed to do with a book talk. And that is, instead of focusing on one particular kind of chapter or analysis that we provide in the book, I'm going to try to give a panoramic view of the book. Okay, so this might leave you a little bit unsatisfied, but hopefully in a good way, in a way that you'll want to go out and buy the book or preferably steal it. It's online. Okay, what am I doing here? I want to discuss how we might come to a better theoretical and historical understanding of the origins of capitalism and the rise of the West that goes beyond the dominant Eurocentric modes of explanation currently characterizing these debates. And this is the subject of my book, co-authored book, with Kerem Nisancioglu, that he just mentioned, How the West Came to Rule. So, some of the key questions that we try to address in the book is, why was capitalism successful in supplanting other historical modes of production? What propelled it to global dominance? Why did it first emerge in Northwestern Europe? And what subsequently led to the West's global ascendancy? And of course, what are capitalism's historical limits? And I'm just putting my timer on here so I don't go over too much. And that last question obviously is very important for a seminar which is about not only critical theory but critical praxis. So these are some of the questions we seek to address in the book. And our aim in doing so was to try to provide new theoretical and historical perspectives in which these questions can be answered anew, and hopefully in ways better than previous attempts. So simply stated, the key argument of the book is that the origins and history of capitalism must be understood from an international or geopolitical perspective, and that this very internationality is itself constitutive of capitalism as a historical mode of production. Now I know, you're thinking to yourself and you're saying, well, God, that's obvious. How intuitively obvious. But as we show in the book in some detail, our existing conceptions of capitalism have really yet, have thus far failed to take this internationality seriously. And this has in turn led to very problematic theorizations of capitalism's origins and developments that limit not only our histories, but our critiques of the present. And this distinctly geopolitical character of the origins of capitalism is brilliantly anticipated in the German Renaissance painter Hans Holbein's 1533 masterpiece, The Ambassadors. As you can see, this illustrates a meeting between two French envoys in London. And the painting astounds for the period because these two aristocratic subjects are placed to the periphery. And the only explicitly religious symbol, the cross, which you'll see right there, is veiled by a curtain. So while these two pillars of medieval power, the church and aristocracy, are symbolically pushed to a side, an anamorphic skull, and a table littered with objects, indeed littered with commodities, are the focal point of the painting. So was this a prophetic, if unwitting, forecast of feudalism's imminent decline? Did it anticipate a capitalist future where social relations would be mediated by things? Now, notwithstanding such speculation, these objects do constitute a vivid record of the geopolitical context that defined European international relations during the early 16th century. The morbidity portrayed by the skull reminds us that death was at the forefront of European consciousness. Indeed, the painter's own life would be taken by the plague just 10 years after the painting's completion. In the immediate time of the painting, peasant revolts were sweeping through Christendom, leaving the ashes of a serfdom overthrown in its wake. In the preceding centuries, Europe had been ravaged by a disease, precipitating a demographic crisis that had decimated between 30 and 60% of Europe's population by the 15th century. And now on the bottom right-hand side of the table, I'm going to stop pointing, you see a book of Lutheran hymns sitting by a broken lute. And this signifies the discord in Christendom between Protestants and the Catholic Church. To the left of these items rests Martin Benheim's terrestrial globe, made under the commission of Nuremberg merchants trying to break the Portuguese monopoly on the spice trade. And the globe is tilted so that after European towns, Africa and Brazil are the most legible markers. We also can see the line of division between Spain and Portugal demarcating the division of the New World between the Habsburg Spanish Empire west of the line and Portugal east of the line. This signifies that the importance of these discoveries and the subsequent competition between European states over commercially profitable territories. And in front of the globe, you'll see a book called A Well and Grounded Introduction to All Merchants' Arithmetic. This was, almost forgot, this was an early textbook of commercial scholarship that covered profit-loss calculation, trading customs, navigation, and route mapping. And placed along Benheim's globe, it demonstrates the inseparability of commercial interest from maritime exploration, as well as the increasingly global and competitive character of trade. And above these items, on top of the table, sits numerous scientific instruments highlighting the rapid development of techniques in seafaring. Continuing the theme of Christendom's decline, it also indicates a mounting shift away from the divinity of religion as the predominant episteme towards the rationality of scientific inquiry and humanism. And finally, linking the resting arm of the two ambassadors and tying all the objects together, we find a Turkic rug. And the presence of this Eastern commodity indicates that the numerous changes taking place in Europe at the time were often undergirded by processes emanating from non-European sources, by social formations and actors that were unambiguously more powerful than anything seen in Europe at the time. So let me run through these themes one more time. A demographic crisis brought about by the Black Death, the Ottoman-Habsburg rivalry, the discovery of the New World and its division along linear spaces of sovereignty, the festering atmosphere of revolt and rebellion, and the economic significance of colonization. Each in their own way either captures or anticipates the central dynamics and historical processes behind the collapse of feudalism and the emergence of capitalist modernity. But moreover, running throughout these themes in the painting is a resolute awareness of the geopolitics behind these processes. The emphasis on the New World and the Ottoman Empire reminds us that the making of capitalism in Europe was not simply an intra-European phenomenon. Rather, it was a decidedly international or intersocietal one in which non-European agencies relentlessly impinged upon and redirected the trajectory and nature of European development. And tracing this intersocietal dimension of the origins of capitalism, the so-called rise of the West, is a central concern of our book. Because despite the latent centrality of the international implied by the painting, dominant theorizations of early modern European development have been constructed with non-European societies, for the most part in absence. Whether in the sphere of politics, economy, culture, ideology, the emergence of capitalist modernity is generally understood as a sui generis development unique to Europe. Where non-European societies do figure, they're typically relegated to the status of a passive bystander. They're at the receiving end of Europe's colonial whip. Or they're a comparative foil, indeed an other, against which the specificity and superiority of Europe is defined. In short, the history of the origins of capitalism is unmistakably a Eurocentric history. So a key aim of our book is to try to challenge these Eurocentric assumptions by examining the extra-European geopolitical conditions and forms of agency conducive to capitalism's emergence over the longue durée. And in this respect, we hope to have contributed to what in recent years has become a veritable historiographical revolution in the study of the early modern epoch. This has come from a disparate group of scholars challenging what they see as the fundamentally Eurocentric nature of extant theoretical and historical approaches to modernity. So debates on the character of modern development have suddenly taken on new dimensions as scholars have forcefully problematized notions of a self-propelling rise of the West while relativizing the uniqueness of a singular Western modern experience. Once sidelined to the margins of historical and sociological investigation, these non-Western sources, dynamics, and experiences of modernity have thus been at the forefront of these literatures. And this has acted as a much-needed corrective to the kinds of essentializing, self-aggrandizing narratives of an internally generated European miracle. So while building on these revisionist accounts of early modern European development, our aim is not simply to add new non-European perspectives that might expand the empirical scope of our study, of a study of capitalism origins, but rather we also seek to go beyond such empirical accounts by offering an alternative framework through which our theorizations of capitalism might be significantly revised. And we do so by drawing on and further refining Leon Trotsky's concept of uneven and combined development, which, as I'll discuss in a moment, uniquely incorporates a distinctly international dimension of causality into its basic conception of development. For implicit in Trotsky's reconceptualization of development as uneven and combined was a fundamental redefinition of the concept and logic of development itself, one inscribed with a more than one ontological premise, capturing the interactive and multilinear nature of development. This then allows for a conceptualization of the international as an object of social theory itself, that is, one organically contained in a conception of development, as Justin Rosenberg has put it. And the debate on the transition to capitalism is a particularly revealing body of literature for assessing the theory's efficacy in theorizing social change, as positions within the debate well demonstrate the very problems that the theory seeks to overcome, specifically the hardened division between internalist and externalist modes of explanation. And within neo-Marxist perspectives, we've seen the different approaches largely split between these two internalist and externalist poles. So on the one side, you have scholars such as Maurice Dobb, Robert Brenner, Ellen Wood, who locate the generative sources of capitalist social relations within the internal dynamics of feudal societies, and particularly England. On the other hand, you have Paul Sweezy and Emmanuel Wallerstein, who view capitalism as having developed from the growth of markets, trade, and exchange in Europe over the long 16th century. So the main issue between these two different positions within the debate revolves around whether the intensification of exchange and trade or internal class conflicts were the quote-unquote prime movers in the transition to capitalism. More recently, we see revisionist scholars who have broadened the debate in considering the emergence of antecedent forms of capitalism or proto-capitalism in the non-West, while emphasizing the contingent or downright lucky factors that explain the rise of the West. Yet for the most part, the revisionists, such as John M. Hobson and Frank, the revisionists have moved within the main methodological parameters of the original debate, accepting an essentially externalist explanation of the genesis of capitalism by highlighting the spread of commerce and markets. So these stark disagreements over precisely what factors were central in the making of capitalism obviously begs the question, well, what do we mean by capitalism? What is capitalism? In some respects, this is the trick question, in that it conceals from view more than it opens up to inquiry, since the content of capitalism is of a complexity that resists any single-line definition. So treating capitalism as generalized commodity production or competitive accumulation of capital through the exploitation of wage labor, or for the political Marxists, the market dependence of economic units. All these capture, in some respect, a hard core around which capitalism necessarily functions. However, the argument we advance in the book is that there is a wider, complex web of social relations that stretch our understanding of capitalism far beyond what these phrases capture. So more specifically, we argue that capitalism is best understood as a set of configurations, assemblages, or bundles of social relations and processes oriented towards the systematic production and reproduction of the capital relation, but not necessarily reducible to that relation alone, either historically or logically. So by placing an emphasis on such configurations and relations, we seek to highlight how the reproduction and accumulation of capital through the exploitation of wage labor presupposes a wider assortment of differentiated social relations that make this reproduction and accumulation possible. So these relations may take numerous forms, such as coercive state apparatuses, ideologies, cultures of consent, or forms of power and exploitation that aren't immediately given or derivative of the simple capital-wage labor relation, such as racism or patriarchy. To take one particular example, One of the great achievements of contemporary feminist scholarship has been to show how the existence of wage labor presupposes a vast reproductive sphere that sits outside, though related, to the immediate production process. So here, non-wage forms of production, such as cooking, housekeeping, childbearing, are fundamental to the reproduction of wage labor, and capitalism is such. And as we demonstrate throughout the book, these sorts of relations and many others were absolutely crucial to both making the accumulation and reproduction of capital possible, as well as producing forms of subordination, exploitation, and social stratification that were at the heart of alienating workers from their labor and from each other. And we argue that an analysis of the making of capitalism should be one that seeks to disclose ever more complex webs, assemblages, and bundles of social relations that feed into the origins and reproduction of capitalism as a mode of production. And to this endeavor, we argue that uneven and combined development provides a way in disclosing and analyzing the historical emergence and development of such configurations that were and still are constitutive of capitalism. So, of course, this begs another question. What exactly do I mean by uneven combined development? And how might it help us better explain the emergence of capitalism and the rise of the West? So here I'm just going to provide a very brief exposition of the theory's two main concepts, from which a number of distinctly geosocial determinations follow. So unevenness. Unevenness denotes the developmental variations both within and between societies, along with the attendant spatial differentiations between them. Bless you. The starting point then is an empirical observation about the basic ontology of human development, that a multiplicity of societies varying in size, culture, political organization, productivity, and socio-economic systems is a general feature of history. And from this general empirical observation, one is then able to capture both the quantitative, that is multiple societies, and qualitative, that is different societies, character of social development, what Trotsky termed uneven development. But rather than simply describing two static conditions of development, uneven development captures their causal interaction. Social multiplicity producing intersocietal interactions, in turn generating societal differences that then feed back into any given geopolitical system in which they form. This then forms the basic social relational texture of the historical process as a whole, whereby the shifting identity of any particular society accumulates and crystallizes. So emphasizing the specificities of a society's development within this wider intersocietal context, we thus demonstrate how a society's development is irreducible to any unilinear path to development. For Trotsky, Russia stood not only geographically, but also socially and historically between Asia and history. As both cause and effect of the international differentiation of unevenness also denotes the peculiar sociological forms of internal differentiation in political, cultural, and class relations. Now, crucially, such relations of unevenness between societies entails what Trotsky terms a whip of external necessity. And in Trotsky's case, this referred to the competitive pressures of the more advanced Western European states on the less developed Russian social formation. And I'm going to carry on with the Russian example here, since it's one that most people, or some people, might know. So since Russian development did not occur endogenously, but always under the influences, pressures, and lessons from the more advanced society, this permitted and indeed compelled the state to reap what Trotsky called a privilege of historic backwardness. Consequently, Russia was able to emulate and potentially innovate upon the most cutting-edge technologies, institutions, and practices by other leading states. And the assimilation and adaptation of such advanced methods and organizational forms to Russian society as finished products meant that the state did not need to repeat the developmental steps or stages originally required to get there. So capitalism in Russia developed over decades instead of centuries, as it did in England. And indeed, Russian development could incorporate the different developmental experiences of other social forms into its social structure, thereby creating unstable hybrids of the old and new. So this unevenness of social existence thereby departs a fundamentally combined character to development. The interactive relations between different societies result in the amalgamation of different political institutions, socioeconomic systems, and ideologies, melding the native and forward, the so-called advanced and backward, within a single society. As with unevenness, combination holds a strong empirical reference. Societies do not simply exist hermetically side by side, rather they interactively coexist, which by necessity and varying degrees determine their collective social and geopolitical development and reproduction. Accordingly, a combined development also refers to the time-compressed processes in which these societies come to draw together the different stages of development, thereby creating multilinear trajectories of development and dispensing with any stageist conception of history. And from this perspective, we argue that historical processes are always the outcome of a multiplicity of spatially diverse, nonlinear causal chains, I know it's a mouthful, that combine in any given conjuncture. And what this compels historians and sociologists to do methodologically is to analyze history from a multiplicity of different spatio-temporal vantage points in order to uncover these causal chains and their interaction. So, for example, Robert Brenner's analysis of primitive accumulation in the English countryside might be one of these spatial-temporal vantage points, but one that needs to be combined with many others. In short, uneven and combined development stresses, indeed necessitates, a genuinely internationalist historiography of capitalism's origin. One that opens up the spatial optic of our analyses of capitalism to those structural processes and agencies emanating from outside Europe. Indeed, as we demonstrate throughout the book, the development of capitalism in Europe was fundamentally rooted within and conditioned by such extra-European structural and agentic processes. Okay. Getting thirsty up here. To give you an idea of the kind of historical analysis this perspective offers, I'm just going to quickly run through some of the key historical processes and dynamics that we examine at length in the book. And of course, I'm happy to go into more detail in the question and answer and anything, because it's going to be a bit quick. So, there's a map of the Mongolian Empire that my wife created. And we begin our historical analysis along the Eurasian steppe over the long 13th century. Here we examine how the expansion of the Mongolian Empire was fundamental to the formation of a number of critical geopolitical and economic linkages across the Eurasian landmass. This had the effect of plugging European actors into an interconnected world system of intersocietal relations. And the immediate consequence of European engagements within the Pax Mongolica was an increased exposure to the technical developments and ideas pioneered by the more scientifically advanced Asian societies. So it was here, the backwaters, the so-called periphery of this world system, the European societies, which were able to reap the kind of privilege of historic backwardness that Trotsky talks about. And while these contributed to an array of developments in Europe, the Pax Mongolica proved not only to be a transmitter of social relations and technologies, but also of disease. The Black Death and the subsequent demographic reordering, which brought European feudalism into crisis, directly stemmed from this widened sphere of intersocietal interactions generated by the Pax Mongolica. And this, as we demonstrate in the book, was a crucial factor in temporarily shifting the balance of caste forces, particularly in England, in favor of the peasantry and leading to the end of serfdom. We then demonstrate in chapter 4 that the subsequent divergence that occurred within Europe in this context was the product of the superpower rivalry between the Ottoman and Habsburg Empire. Oops. Through military pressures, the Ottoman state further undermined existing centers of feudal ruling class power, such as the papacy, the Habsburg Empire, and the Italian city-states, and supported new counter-hegemonic forces, such as Protestants, the French, and the Dutch. And crucially, by acting as a geopolitical center of gravity, which attracted Habsburg military resources to the Mediterranean and Central Eastern Europe, Northwestern European states were thereby afforded the structural geopolitical space that proved crucial to their development along capitalist lines and their ability to begin conducting modern state-building practices. So think of the Dutch Revolt, right? In particular, the Ottomans unintentionally created for the English a condition of geopolitical isolation, which, we argue, directly contributed to the homogeneous character of the English ruling classes, also its demilitarization of the aristocracy, and thus its success in enclosing and engrossing the land. So the process of primitive accumulation in the English countryside engendering capitalist relations were therefore inextricably tied to this geopolitical threat of the Ottoman Empire. So those things that Robert Brenner and Ellen Wood are talking about, which in their form is a kind of internalist method of analysis, actually are conditioned by this wider geopolitical context. And at the same time, the Ottoman dominance of the Mediterranean and land routes to Asia served to push northwestern European states onto an altogether novel global sphere of activity, the Atlantic. So in chapter 5, we then focus on this Atlantic theater, where we analyze the manifold impact of the New World discoveries on the development of Europe. We firstly show how the intersocietal interactions, conflicts, and struggles between the Europeans and Amerindians were crucial to the emergence of modern forms of territorial sovereignty and the development of Eurocentrism, secularized linear conceptions of time, scientific racism, and the modern institution of patriarchy. All relations, institutions, ideologies that were fundamental to bringing forth capitalist modernity. We then demonstrate that the subsequent plundering of the American precious metals by Europeans further exacerbated an already nascent divergence between the feudalism of the Iberian states and the incipient capitalism of northwestern European societies, such as the United Provinces and England. And by the way, this is a map from 1503 that shows the line of division between the Habsburg Empire and Portugal. We argue that the development of capitalism in England was itself dependent on this widened sphere of activity offered by the Atlantic. And in particular, we show how it was through the sociological combination of American land, African slave labor, and English merchant capital that the limits of English agrarian capitalism were eventually overcome. Not only did the widened sphere of circulation provided by the transatlantic triangular trade offer numerous opportunities and benefits for British capitalists to expand their sphere of activity, but the combination of these different labor processes across the Atlantic enabled the recomposition of labor in Britain through the Industrial Revolution. And it was in and through these crucial preconditions of capitalist development that the foundations were subsequently laid for the bourgeois revolutions in Europe. These revolutions had the effect of establishing and consolidating territorially demarcated sovereign centers of capital accumulation, first in Holland, then England, and finally France. Moreover, as we show, the international determinations spurred by the sequential character of the revolutions, with each impacting on the next, were also crucial to their development, entering into the very definitions of their differences. In chapter 7, we then examine in more detail the development of a form of proto-capitalism in the Low Countries and its attendant limits based upon a relatively low supply of labor. This labor shortage threatened to choke off the United Provinces' incipient form of capitalism, which was only overcome by tapping into a vast well of labor from elsewhere. In Asia, the VOC, the Dutch East Indian Company, was responsible for creating a commercial network that combined uneven labor processes spanning the spice-producing islands in Indonesia, precious metal production in China and Japan, and textile workers in India, and they integrated this into a single integrated network of global production. Crucially, this took place in response to the variegated challenges of resistance and accommodation posed by the Southeast Asian communities in response to Dutch activities in the region. And so it was through these intersocietal reactions with the various communities across the Indian Ocean, and ultimately through their subordination, subjugation, and subsumption, that the Dutch were able to integrate a disparate yet large mass of labor power into their own operations. We argue that the development and ultimate survival of the institutional innovations central to the development of capitalism in Holland, such as the Beurs, the Amsterdam Entrepot, and the VOC, were all based on this subjugated and exploited mass of unfree Asian labor power. So in this sense, we can see again how the wage-labor capital relation is being produced and reproduced by social relations that are not derivative of this relation alone. So in the final chapter, we see how these multiple determinations emanating from the various non-European origins are combined in order to produce a conjunctural analysis of the rise of the West. We demonstrate how the multiple geopolitical advantages that thrust Europe to global ascendancy were based on these prior influences from the more powerful non-European societies. In particular, European exceptionalism, insofar as that it was exceptional at all, was rooted in the exceptional accrual and deployment of the means of violence against these non-European societies. in which the interactions between these societies actually generated these means of violence. So the combinations of these advantages were instrumental to Britain's colonization of India, which we argue marked the historical juncture in which the West began to rise to global dominance. So through an examination of these various historical processes and dynamics, we argue that any historical narrative or theoretical explanation of the origins of capitalism or the rise of the West cannot simply begin and end with analysis of Europe, or more narrowly, England's internal development, but rather that it can only be properly appreciated through a genuinely historical and theoretical analysis of the global, and more often than not, non-Western sources of capitalism's emergence. And I'll just show you, that's the book. Thank you.
Thank you. This is really interesting. And I guess this is really to provide an opportunity for some clarification. I'm really sympathetic to the arguments that you put forward. And in a sense, we know already, certainly for historians and political scientists, there's been this information out there already that, for instance, Europe was a backwater, it's a subcontinent of Asia. The technological advances that are attributed to capitalism were the steam engine, the printing machine, etc., were already invented in China. Trade was, global trade was actually much more vibrant before the rise of capitalist colonialism, etc. So we know those things. In some ways, what is unique about capitalism is the social organization, is the fact that society was reorganized along similar lines. So I guess my question is to ask you, what is the intellectual and political payoff of actually suggesting that others have contributed as well to the rise of capitalism in Europe? Because to some extent, it's useful to demolish the uniqueness of Europe, but at the same time, we can't erase it completely, right? So there is something unique about Europe in the sense that capitalism, this particular form of social organization, not good, not something that we want to replicate around the world, but this particular form of social organization does originate in Europe. So I was curious about what exactly is the intellectual and political payoff for this argument for you. Because I guess, let me clarify also. So underlying seems to be a strand of critical theory that still thinks of capitalism as an advance on whatever else had existed beforehand. And, I don't buy that, but I suspect that you are conflating capitalism and development and advancement and progress together. But I may be wrong.
We're taking a few at a time?
No, just.
Oh, you want to? Oh, I get to respond now. Okay. So yes, capitalism obviously is very unique. It's a transformation of the form of social organization and society, and it does only emerge in Northwestern Europe, as we show. The intellectual, I guess I should start by saying it was more of an intellectual curiosity that when I was reading the literature on early modern development, that I kept getting this internalist story of the origins of capitalism, such as Brenner, Ellen Wood, the others I've mentioned, of just kind of generating itself out of nothing, right? Out of these internal class conflicts. And being from international relations, I just was very interested as to what else was going on and what may have been contributing to these developments. So that kind of led me in a journey where I suddenly stumbled upon this, there's a book in a footnote about the Pax Mongolica and the contributions to capitalism. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. Then I stumbled upon Kerem, my co-author's article about the Ottoman origins of capitalism. I go, my God, this is fascinating. So it was just, just as an intellectual curiosity, it just seemed that you couldn't tell the story of how capitalism emerged, uniquely in Northwestern Europe without taking into account these kind of broader international geopolitical processes. And I thought that's an interesting story to tell. But of course, we're Marxists, so we're not just looking for what's interesting. We're looking for what's the political, what is this, how does this alter our conceptions of the present also? And what are the political payoffs, as you put? And I think the broader theoretical framework, and also we talk about this a little bit in the conclusion of our book, is that Marxists always talk about internationalism, right? And of course, the debate I think, was won between internationalism, world revolution versus socialism in one country. So we're all internationalists. But they don't really take seriously what is unique about political multiplicity. What is unique about societal multiplicity? What about the pressures of the interstateness of capitalism that can lead to the types of processes that led to the type of degeneration of socialist revolution or socialist-inspired revolutions? And I think there's a tendency to kind of talk internationalism, but then say our program from our vantage point here in this singular country, in our experience, we're going to extrapolate, and that's the program everyone should follow. Right? So it's about taking social and political multiplicity and societal difference very seriously for how we formulate socialist tactics and strategy. Right? And we talk about that at length in the book, and I can speak about it a little bit more later. In regarding to the underlying idea that capitalism is more advanced or something of that nature, no, I don't agree with that. Right? So there's a criticism of our book by another author that's saying, so what? All these non-European agents and processes, they fed into capitalism. But how is that progressive, more progressive as far as social theory, because capitalism is a horrible thing? Well, it's not about just saying that these processes were important, but it's just about reintroducing the agency of non-Western societies into any form of development or any historical processes, which they're always left out. And that's not only a political issue, right? The issue of how we take this economy. We can't talk about the history of 20th century socialism without taking the non-West into account, of course, right? But it's also about you just can't get to a good explanation or an adequate explanation without bringing these processes in, right? So that's why we're very critical of the political Marxists, for example.
I was going to pick up on that point actually about the extent to which capitalism as a mode of production is conceived as an advance on whatever it is that went before. And I was going to ask whether you've looked at Marx's writings on the Russian road to capitalism, or that idea that in this kind of Trotsky's concept of uneven and combined development, the unevenness, you almost might think of it as a sort of high water mark, right? That these sort of supposedly backward nations are catching up, but you don't necessarily need to think of it like that. And the trajectory of the gaze doesn't need to be forward. It might be more kind of facing two ways than that, insofar as Marx is thinking about the peasant communes or the mirs or the opportunists, and thinking about these forms of sort of social formations as not necessarily just gone and finished and historical and superseded and therefore backward, but as forms of sort of sociality that might almost prefigure a post-capitalist form of society. So what I was really going to ask is, does your account of the origins of capitalism help us to think beyond it?
I would like to think so. So, I mean, let me clarify something, because you might be thinking here, oh, how ironic this guy sitting up here talking about he's trying to go beyond Eurocentrism, and he's talking about backwardness and calling societies backward. We have a very particular conception of what backwardness means. So when we're talking about backwardness, we're talking about imbalances of power relations and the kind of stability and forms of reproduction of ruling class relations. So that's our definition. It's about power imbalances, right, within and between societies. Right? So that's, in that sense, backwards. So the Ottomans were more advanced because they had much stronger structures of ruling class reproduction, right, than, say, the feudal lords in Europe. As far as the last thing you asked was about the present. So yes, that certain forms that might be considered, certain forms of societal organization that might be considered backward today might actually be presenting the kind of the way forward, right? I don't want to give any examples because I'm not sure if I want to go there, but yes, absolutely, right? That they're not just thrown away, right? That they're not just kind of discarded. This is what I mean by trying to get past this kind of historicist, and I mean historicist in Chakrabarty's sense and provincializing Europe, this historicist stages conception of history, right? And we talk about very strongly about this in the nomads and non-state agencies, right? How they're kind of an anti-history almost. Writing their history is like an anti-history because they're kind of written out of the kind of stories and narratives of progress and state formation and all these other things in which they were a huge part in forming, right? And they were always considered more backward. And in many ways, they were more advanced.
Drew, you had a question.
Yep, sorry.
Hi. Yes, the question I have comes out of your title, and it's sort of addressed to whether capitalism is really a noun. Because it seems to me that both the notion of the West and capitalism run the risk of taking socialist relations to which the adjective capitalist might be relevant and trying to make a noun. And it seems to me significant in the way Marx discusses that he almost never uses the noun capitalism. There's a couple of places where you could say the right translation of the capitalist system was capitalism. But in describing a system as capitalist, he's not going to come up with this model of a capitalist society that's something unified around capital. Precisely, I think, because the logic of capital doesn't kind of sit in a system it's much more dangerously kind of fragile in relation to its temporality and its history. So in the way in which you might say there's a history to the logic of capital, then it would be possible to say there are geopolitical origins in the primitive accumulation of capital. So it looks clear in Marx's account of Capital that the discovery of gold and silver, the slave trade, the operations in various aspects of what's going on in India, all those kind of things create opportunities for the primitive accumulation of capital. And on the basis of primitive accumulation, various other things can happen. That's a story about the construction of this kind of strange fictional noun called capital, which can scarcely exist except in certain kind of relations and is sustained by certain relations like banks. But to the extent that there's a system called capitalism, or a system that constitutes all of these things as glued together as capitalist, that seems to me to be much more a problem of the critics of capitalism than of capital itself. It doesn't need to believe in capitalism, it just needs to believe in capital relations in all kinds of ways. There are capitalists, but there are plenty of capitalists who don't believe in capitalism, and I think they might be right to think that there isn't necessarily such a thing as capitalism. And that, I think, is even more true of the West. Who's in the West? That seems to me geopolitically a much more obviously kind of bogus category in relation to the way in which it's used as a sort of social shorthand for, I presume, European banks and American banks and their political allies in relation to certain constructions of West. But actually the West breaks up pretty quickly the minute you apply even a kind of modestly sort of socialist analysis of what we mean. So I kind of think there's a danger in the West and capitalism as a the in relation to the consequences of the argument.
Yeah, well, the West, despite the title without the scare quotes, we used it in scare quotes throughout the book because the entire argument is about how the West is socially and historically constructed and how it's always changing and mutating, and how even Europe is socially and historically constructed, what's considered European and non-European. So it's a spatial, social category that is completely unstable and changing throughout history, so I would agree with that. As far as capitalism being, I guess the totality is what you're talking about, right? Something systemic, something systematized. We make a very clear differentiation between capital, right, and kind of earlier forms of capital and prior forms of capital, and capitalism, right? But I would want to retain a notion of capitalism as far as a kind of, there's distinct laws of motion to capitalism, right? There's a distinct logic which is systemic to capitalism, right? Even if we have to understand capitalism in a broader conception than what we usually have. So I don't think it's very problematic to speak in terms of capitalism, as long as we're understanding this is very different in different places. So at one point we talk about, it's not really capitalism, but capitalisms, right? But it doesn't matter whether or not capitalists think they're capitalists or people think they're capitalists. We're living in a capitalist system, which we're structured by that logic of process. So I don't think it's so much of a problem. I mean, as long as you're not thinking there's an overbearing structural determination to everything in which we can't, there's no forms of agency. If that's where you're going with the criticism, but.
Hello. I also have a question actually from the title, which was
Could you speak up just a little bit?
Oh,
I'm half deaf.
My question also comes from your title, where it says came to rule. And you've spoken a lot about capitalism, and I think many of us can automatically make our own understanding of why capitalism and coming to rule are so integrated. But I'd like to maybe hear you unpack the relationship between the origins of capitalism and this idea of coming to rule, and why they're so interconnected in your book.
Sure. So yeah, we actually, so most of the book is about the origins of capitalism and the historical processes and dynamics leading to the making of capitalism. It's really in the final chapter in which we give this kind of more both a combination of a structural conjunctural analysis of why that led to certain states kind of coming to global dominance, right? So we argue that while capitalism provides, because normally this, within Marxist circles, it's kind of the transition to capitalism affords certain states a huge productive advantage over other states, and that's the reason why the West came to rule, right? So the two questions are actually conflated, right? You see that in Robert Brenner's work, you see that in Beto Teschke's work, you see it even in Manuel Wallerstein's work. So we wanted to differentiate between capitalism providing the conditions of possibility and the productive potential, right, to possibly lead to that form of trajectory, always being overdetermined by all these extra-European sources and dynamics, and it's a moment where it actually is transformed into this global relationship of dominance, right? And the crucial moment there is 1757 for us, with the taking of Bengal, so the Britain's colonization of India, right? And we show how these various spatio-temporal vectors of uneven combined development kind of combine in that conjuncture, allowing for the British, because the Mughal Empire, for example, which was much more advanced before then, as far as the British state, was under severe stress from geopolitical challenges and internal conflicts. And this allowed the opportunity for Britain, who had by that point developed just a slight advantage in naval capacities over its Asian competitors, to be able to colonize it, right? So in that sense, it was a contingently determined, but a contingently determined analysis where contingency is kind of theorized or internalized within the bounds of theory. And it was from that period onward, from Britain both exploiting the Atlantic and exploiting the cotton and Indian textiles and everything, that allowed them to then rise to global power, particularly through also the use of the Indian contingents in the British Empire military. So that's the kind of processes that came together in that period. So it's not as the revisionists say, it's only with British industrialization that the West came to rule. It's not like the kind of internalist analysis that it's in the 17th century when origins of capitalism emerged. That's why the West came to rule. We kind of place it somewhere in between. So we have to look at this kind of conjunctural analysis of how Britain was able to colonize the Indian landmass, and then from there be able to expand its operations throughout the globe.
Hi.
Yeah.
So this is a bit confusing in my head. I need you to help asking me this question. Help me ask this question. It's a bit more epistemological one, I suppose. The problem that I repeatedly see with kind of this global studies wave or this post-colonial wave is that there is a process of integrating other factors and other agencies in a previous history that we already had, right? And in this integration, there is always a process of assimilation to a certain point. So, for example, when you say you do this remark on what internationalist Marxists are saying is actually, yes, revolution must be international, but we know how things work here in our country, and then we just diffuse this idea to the rest. There is something of your own argument that is being diffused, like from your place of enunciation, that is being diffused to analyze other places that do not necessarily think in your framework. This is why I'm saying that the question is confusing in my head. Try to repeat this in other terms. You do an analysis of other countries and other cultures and other places, but you inscribe this analysis in the same terms that people have been using to do a history of Europe, the Eurocentric and Western-centered Europe. And you say, for example, oh, I'm using backwardness as an expression, but it's like a contingent expression. I can perfectly change. It just means like in relation to the power, it's just a question of the power relations. But in fact, you are projecting a sole model of power relations. Your analysis doesn't seem to give to open the possibility that power relations function in any other way than non-depending on capital, for example. And a second question to this would be, isn't in fact trying to write the proper, right, true history, complete history of a certain historical development, a way of expanding kind of West's power in that sense?
Okay. If I understood your question differently, so you're basically taking, in a sense, Chakrabarty's argument that since our theories are being formulated in the West, they're incorporating epistemologically certain assumptions about how development occurs in how power relations occur throughout the world, and that therefore they're reproducing these kind of Eurocentrisms.
Yeah.
Yep, okay. I agree, and we draw a lot on the post-colonial literatures, especially Chakrabarty, Guhan, others. I agree with them about the Western-centric notions of development and Western theories that we have on offer. The problem with their analysis and with the argument is that I don't think they identify actually what the issue is, why they are Eurocentric, right? They're Eurocentric because they're based upon a conception of society based in the singular abstract, what Justin Rosenberg calls an ontologically singular conception of society. So there is, you analyze a society, a preformed theory of domestic society, and then you extrapolate it to the rest of the world, right? That leads to kind of disregarding the kind of interactive relations between societies and the way in which they combine and form multilinear forms of development. But interestingly, in the preface to the second edition of Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe, he makes a universal claim. He makes a universal claim that history was different and power relations were different in India because of other developments elsewhere, and therefore they're different all over the world. So what is that? How do we capture that societal differences? How do we capture those multilinear trajectories? We have to have a theory that organically incorporates that interactive and multilinear dimension of development. And that's why I think it's unique that Trotsky's idea of uneven and combined development, which was first generated just to explain the socialist revolution in Russia, held this potential to redefine, as I said before, the concept and logic of development itself. Because it inscribes within its generative grammar political multiplicity.
Then
Yep.
the other side of the question then would be, why does to relate with these others has to be a question of capturing them, using the expression you said yourself. So
what do you mean?
You said like, how do we capture this difference? How do we capture this otherness? And I'm asking, why do you need to capture it? Why does politics and the payoff that you take from writing a theory, why do you need to create a narrative that encompasses all of these things?
Well, I mean, there may be a larger question here of just epistemological differences, that you just can't have kind of grand narratives in theory, which I reject. I think we can have better grand narratives in theory, and I think any Marxist would say that we need to have grand narratives in theory, right? Grand narratives in the kind of post-structuralist sense. So unless you're a relativist, which I don't even think Chakrabarty is actually, he says this is not, this is not, yeah, I know, I'm just saying you're talking about post-colonialism, and the question you ask is very much within that tradition that Chakrabarty's talking about, Guha, Chakrabarty, the subaltern studies. So unless you reject grand narratives and explanation, theoretical explanation, rather than describing arbitrary instantiations of difference, I want a theory that can actually understand those differences and the interactively generated sources of their differences and why power relations are different. And you said before, why do power relations necessarily have to function around capitalism? Well, they don't. And that's where the combined development part comes in, right? That it's not just capitalism going on within these societies, but different combined forms, right, of capitalism fusing with feudalism, capitalism and slavery, that create laws of motion that are for those societies that are not reducible to either of those different modes of production, but it's the more of the sum of their parts, right? So we talk about the encomienda system in the Spanish Empire, in the Americas, and we talk about how they actually retain these tributary relations, right, while grafting onto them certain feudal forms of social relations, as well as then becoming more kind of oriented towards a capitalist world market later on, as well as having slave labor as well. So you have this kind of 4 different modes of production combining at once, rather than say, and that's an articulation and capturing of difference, then a kind of subsumption or negating of difference that you see in Wallerstein's world systems analysis, which just says, well, the encomienda is within this world system and therefore it's capitalist, which I think is horribly wrong. And you could say the same thing today with struggles. How do you understand what it is you're facing, right? Is it just everything's capitalist and you orient your strategies thus in that sense, or do you understand the differences? So that's what I think the importance is.
Question like that.
Thank you. So in the title is the geopolitical origins of capitalism. So I was expecting a more explanation of the modern state. So how does the book play out the relation of the emergence of the modern state with the emergence of capitalism?
A good question. we don't spend too much time talking about the formation of the modern state system. We spend a bit of time. The key kind of insight from our book is that we trace how the origins of modern sovereignty and linear defined territoriality and political claims of political authority, which are based on these linear defined claims, emerges not in Europe, in say with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, but emerges in the late 15th century in the Atlantic. Right? So we argue and we demonstrate in some detail how you have these novel forms of linear spaces of sovereignty emerging and being developed there in the Atlantic, in the Americas, that then later radiate back to the imperial metropole. And we show how this was actually very much a response to the challenges and the forms of resistance in the Atlantic, found in the Atlantic and the Americas, and the ways in which the colonial powers wanted to compete against each other and make sure that they could carve out spaces of political authority which were sovereign in theirs vis-a-vis other competing colonial powers. So it gives a very different story than the usual story that you found in Benno Teschke's work or Manuel Wallerstein or Giovanni Righi about the formation of the modern state system, which is all the story that begins and ends in Europe.
This is more sort of
Speak up a little bit.
This is maybe a more general point of interest than a direct question, but the way you're talking about sort of the InState Aspects of capitalism, I was maybe just going to ask or just say maybe a bit about Sabir, so the development of a pidgin language in the medieval period in the Levant, where sort of Genoese, North Italian city-states and various traders in their interactions with the Muslim states, Arab states, and the Ottoman Empire developed a unique pidgin by which they could communicate, but only within mercantile sort of trading spheres, and how that actually developed a unique linguistic community in the Mediterranean just before the period of direct colonial expansion towards the Atlantic, and how this was almost kind of like a forging of a sort of almost unique mercantile subjectivity directly between kind of these two, the feudal blocks of Europe, which are far more regulated, and these sort of like more eastern political blocks. And just, yeah, sorry, as I say, it's sort of like quite difficult to pose a question. I just think it's a very interesting sort of way of looking at it in kind of like a concrete linguistic history, the construction of this liminal kind of like territory of speech between these cultures that was directly centred on the sort of like this proto-capitalist, even maybe kind of capitalist before the fact subjectivity. Sorry.
Sure, it sounds like you got a research project. I'd say go for it. Hopefully you'll find the theoretical framework here helpful for doing it. I don't know anything about that. It sounds fascinating. I'd like to see an article about it. So go for it. Yep.
Kyle, sorry. There's someone else that you before you go.
So my question harkens back to some earlier questions, but I'm just wondering if you could, and I haven't read the book yet, so you may address it there. Could you speak a little with respect to the shorthand you're using, where you describe state actors acting unilaterally? It doesn't seem to ring true even with the very basic materialist histories we have to date. I mean, you look at the capture of India by the English, most of that was done by the East India Company, who were working in contravention to their own offices in London, let alone political manifestations of power. So are we really right to be talking about how Western states, how European states went to Southeast Asia, perverted their course of history, grabbed up the labor, and then took the fruits back home, when we know that's not the case? So if that's not the case, does it problematize the narrative that you're building here?
In short, no. I mean, there's a problem when you're talking about Western states, British state, anything, when you're reifying something that really shouldn't be reified. And we try to pay attention to that in the book when we're talking about, in Latin America, the conquistadors are going there, and the tensions between the Spanish crown and the conquistadors and things like that. We talk at length about the English East India Company in their operations and their taking of Bengal, 1757, and things of that nature. So at best we can, we are trying to identify what are the agents actually. Of course, in a talk, it's kind of shorthand. I'm just using states. Maybe it's a bit lazy, but easier to do it that way. So, and again, it's same with the Dutch as well. We're not talking about the Dutch state. We're talking about the VOC and what they're doing in this in the Southeast Asian community. So it's a fair question.
Question.
Hi. Your book actually kind of made me think a lot about the history of globalization and all the arguments and conversations about the issue with globalization. So I was just wondering, firstly, what's your take or what's your opinion on Kenneth Pomeran's Great Divergence, and secondly, what's your take on the issues and the problems with the history of globalization?
So the first one, Pomerantz. We draw on Pomerantz a bit. The problem with Pomerantz is that it's a problem with many of the revisionist scholars that the kind of anti-Eurocentric analyses provided by John Hobson, by Frank, by Pomerantz, by Guy here, Jack Goody, is that while they're trying to kind of get beyond this European exceptionalism, they make the opposite mistake of saying that before the capitalist industrialization, there was basically no developmental differences between all Eurasian states. So you see this in particular in Jack, I think his name is Goldstone's work, right? Where it's kind of like in terms of productivity, state forms, all these other things, there was no difference. And that simply just doesn't work. And empirically it doesn't work. So when they get to try to explain why it was this handful of northwestern states that come to rise to global prominence, the only thing they can do is fall back on completely self-contained contingent explanation. So it's just, I mean, as Goldstone says, it's just downright luck, right? I think for Pomerantz, it's the contingent combination of coal and colonies. Well, the colonies weren't that contingent, right? There's an explanation behind why they were colonized, right? And what the sources they used and the differential effects of it. So we're very critical in that sense of Pomerantz and the other revisionists, in that they date the Great Divergence slightly too late. So they dated at the beginning of the 1800s, where we dated at really the middle of the 18th century, 1757, given the strategic and economic importance of the colonization of India for the British Empire and its ability to open up other markets of the world. And again, we criticize them on this kind of ontological flattening of all what we call the Eurasian homogeneity thesis. And Joseph Bryant has a good article on that. As far as history of the globalization, I mean, I'm not a fan of the term globalization. I mean, it's fine as a descriptive. I just don't like it as far as, because what are we talking about? What's globalizing? It's capital globalizing, what's expanding, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's more interesting and more fruitful to talk about the history of capitalism. But I mean, it would have a very significant implications for histories of globalization, as far as that if you really want to see the beginning of globalization, you look to the Pax Mongolica. And I think Ronald Findlay, the historian Ronald Findlay, talks about this is really the beginning of globalization. Of course, there are, again, not to be ahistorical, there are different forms of globalization, right? And of course, the one we see at the late 19th century or post-Bretton Woods system are very different forms. But this globalizing dynamic on pretty much any definition of globalization, you see that beginning with the Pax Mongolica. That's why I think globalization is kind of a slippery term that doesn't really give us much explanatory power, if at all.
Pierre?
Yeah, I'm going to ask the annoying academic question about uneven and combined development. I see how it's kind of useful as a metaphor or an umbrella concept to bring like a more complex and more differentiated historical narrative. But how does it make it a theory, in a sense that Brenner and all these people were trying to find like the causal mechanism that led to the emergence of capitalism in Europe, and how uneven and combined development can give us like some clues about the causal mechanisms beyond like the complex, rich historical narrative?
Yeah, good question, really good question. So we talk about the theory of uneven and combined development as a shorthand, but really, and we talk about this at length in chapter 2 in the book, we use it in 3 different ways. We use it as a methodology, as kind of a kind of general presupposition that you have to incorporate into a preformed theory. So, for example, we talk about how Marx uses the general abstraction of production in general, right? And we make an argument that this is a general abstraction which is transhistorically valid. But from there, he doesn't build a kind of theory of a general theory of production. right? He uses it to form different theories of different modes of production, very historical, right? So it's only by incorporating uneven combined development as a general abstraction to our theories that we're able to incorporate this kind of hidden intersocietal dimension of development. But to get any sort of explanatory power out of it, it has to still be rooted within, if you're a Marxist, a mode of production framework, right? So in that sense, it's only a theory at the more historically concrete level, right? Where we're talking about the kind of broader dynamics of a particular dominant mode of production that's animating, right? So to understand the scales, forms, and dynamics of any uneven combined development, you need to understand what are the different modes of production that are interacting, what's the dominant mode of production, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the benefit of uneven combined development is that it does internalize the kind of surplus of determinations that fall out of a methodologically internalist analysis that we see from the kind of ontologically singular conceptions of history. That's a mouthful. So, for example, Marx talks about the double relationship, right? The relationship between man and nature and the social relationship within the society, between different men, right? The labor process, right? We argue, drawing from Kerem Nisancioglu, that with uneven combined development, we have to look at this as a triple relationship between the metabolic interaction between man and nature, between man and different men. I'm sorry, I'm using this very gendered here, sorry. People, human beings and other human beings, the social relations that emerge, and also intersocietal relations, right? So it's a triple relationship. So I think this sensitizes us to the types of intersocietal dynamics that usually fall out of any sort of abstract conception of a society in the singular. But again, it can't do any explaining without that mode of production-based framework, or whatever your preferred theory is. Does that kind of help?
Question.
Thank you. My question is a bit broad, in that the series title is Critical Theory in Practice, or in Practice, whatever it is. So my question is the practice side of things. With this wonderful theory behind us, and you're grateful and all that, where can this fit, or where would you suggest this fits into social movements that are coming about, or political issues that maybe we can take action from here?
I mean, it's a good question, and I thought I'd get something like this, obviously with the title of the seminar series. Any theory, to my mind at least, is somewhat politically indeterminate, right? I know we see these parties, whether it's the theory and the politics, they fit, they have this strong organic unity. Well, it's just not true, right? Any theory is slightly partially politically indeterminate. So I don't have a program, I guess, that I can give you, or a kind of, well, we need to struggle in this certain sense. What I think the theory provides, though, or offers, it can be interpreted as offering, is against programmatic statements, right? Against the kind of the subordination and kind of ironing out discipline of the unified party that's going to lead the revolution, and we are the way. That doesn't work, because there are many struggles, there are many oppressions, there are many different forms of power. And to take that difference in multiplicity into account means that you may not have the way. Now that doesn't mean you have to have some sort of political relativism, but it is a sensitivity of learning from different struggles and different forms of oppression and the type of struggles that they manifest, and then maybe those within the so-called backward world are the most advanced, and you should be learning your lessons from them and not the other way around.
Perhaps in a practical way that is more abstract, so that you can link the two. And it may be that you haven't thought about it beyond the context of the historical processes and stuff. But I wonder what your book or what your theory can tell us about what's going on now in international relations. I mean, it's not very new, but sort of the institutionalization of the world order, and the sort of emergence of all these international organizations which crystallize particular geopolitical, perhaps, imbalances and things like that. I mean, in the European Union, we saw the trouble that this has created with Greece and stuff, and this is that, from the insights you gain from your study, is that sort of the next stage of trying to sort of crystallize particular geopolitical and also universalization of capital within institutions that are then removed from the modern state, in which case we're not in a modern state anymore, but in a post, whatever we could call it. And yeah, can you speak maybe to some of these things?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much asking for analysis of the contemporary conjuncture of world politics.
Well,
I mean, it sounds like the second book. It seems like a volume 2 would be good. Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've thought about, but I don't have an answer. I mean, I would certainly think that the framework that we provide would be helpful and useful. I mean, if you think of the rise of China, the kind of time-compressed forms of combined development that's going on there, the destabilization of the American Empire, the decline of the United States, this is all uneven and combined development, right? So there is definitely something, or even within the Euro crisis, the forms of differentiated development within this so-called kind of homogeneous zone of Europe that we like to call Europe. So I think it would definitely have things to
And Eurocentricity, I think, is quite relevant here because a lot of, outside Europe, people might see the whole system unfolding quite differently. Whereas in Europe, there is still this Eurocentricity that is extreme.
Absolutely. If you're going to write a history of the 20th century, you can't write a history of the 20th century, even if you're talking about just Europe without talking about the rest of the world. The Cold War, the global Cold War, everything, the communist revolutions, communist-inspired revolutions, I should say, throughout the global South. So it is something we've thought about, my author and I, and maybe one day I'll convince him that we need to write a second volume to bring it up to date.